Hello, my name is Marc Feeley. I'm a food safety risk assessment advisor for the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, or GFoRSS. The topic of the presentation today is the safety assessment processes for food additives. And primarily, we're interested in the global or international perspective. So essentially what we'll be discussing is a few issues related to food safety, laying the groundwork why food additives would be used. Secondly, we'll be dealing with chemicals that appear in food. And thirdly, we'll be discussing the international process where food additives are reviewed. And this is primarily done by the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. It's a joint group led by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. So I guess the main question is, there are chemicals in all food, even non-processed food, but should we be worried? Generally, any chemical that's being deliberately added to the food supply is subject to a very stringent pre-market control. So there is typically a full safety assessment and a risk management conducted for these chemicals prior to they appearing in the food supply or being approved for use in the food supply. And generally, any chemical that is being intentionally added to food is any issue with it. Generally, it results from an accidental misuse or possibly a deliberate adulteration attempt. Typically, we feel that chemicals unintentionally present in food represent a greater health risk. And these are things such as contaminants and natural toxins and marine toxins, etc. So the broad categorization would be chemicals that are being intentionally added to food and chemicals that are non-intentionally added substances appearing in the food supply. So the main chemicals that are intentionally present in food, so these chemicals are being intentionally added to the food supply, are being added for a specific purpose. So the main three chemicals that are being used in the food supply intentionally are food additives, pesticides, and veterinary drugs. So the main issue is that through the pre-market control of the addition of these chemicals, in particular food additives, you can establish safe levels, and these are termed maximum levels. And the approval for use of a food additive generally confers not only a specific food category that it can be used in, but also the maximum level that can appear in the food. So the main feature of this is that the maximum level for use must be as low as possible to achieve the technological reason for its use. And all chemicals associated with food additive use, the residues found in food and therefore for human exposure, must be safe for consumers. Typically, a food additive is a chemical which is not normally an ingredient in the food, and it's being added to the food for a technological purpose. And this includes, sort of organoleptic properties, so smell, taste, appearance, etc. And the use of this chemical in the food results in it becoming a component or affecting the characteristics of the food. So, and typically what you find is that the more processing of a food, the higher probability that it contains one or more food additives. And this is simply food structure and function is being changed due to processing. And in a lot of cases, these food additives are being added to the food to return or recover this process. So there are typically greater than 20 different categories of food additives. Food additives are usually assigned based on their function. And some of the main types of food additives currently in use are things such as anti-caking agents. So it's a chemical being added to food which is normally anhydrous to prevent clumping. Antioxidants, artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, acidifiers, and colors. So in general, when you're dealing with food additives, you have, food additives are being added for a specific technological function. And in certain cases, this is supporting food safety, such as acidifiers and antioxidants. And in other cases, you have food additives that are being added for organoleptic properties, such as coloring agents. We're discussing about the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. It's an international organization that's jointly funded by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. So the primary function of GFoRSS is to perform risk assessments and provide advice related to food safety. So who benefits from the output of GFoRSS? This would be both the member or the founding members, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, but also member countries and the Codex Alimentation Commission. The Codex Alimentation Commission is an international organization that was first formed in the early 1960s, and it was formed also through efforts of the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization. So the main purpose of Codex Alimentation Commission is both to support food safety, so consumer safety, but also to support international trade. So to define specific food codes, guidelines, codes of practice, etc., all with the goal of supporting safe food and also supporting international trade in food. There's various codex committees. The ones that are specific to substances being directly added to food are the Codex Committee on Food Additives, the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food, Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs in Food, and there's also a Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues. So typically, any food standard that is developed by this Codex Alimentation Commission is based on GFoRSS evaluations. The main issue is that Codex Alimentation Commission is open for worldwide membership, and currently approximately 96% of the countries in the world belong to Codex. So how are GFoRSS evaluations performed? Typically, GFoRSS considers a large amount of toxicology data. Typically, this toxicology data is generated in experimental animals through studies that are conducted according to defined guidelines and good laboratory practices. In certain cases, the studies also incorporate data from human studies, especially for artificial sweeteners. The other issue that GFoRSS conducts, besides the full toxicological assessment of proposed food additives, is that they are able to conduct a detailed exposure assessment based on the requested use of the food additives in the foods and the concentrations. Essentially, what does GFoRSS cover? The main issue specifically for food additives, it also deals with processing aids. Processing aids are those chemicals that are used to assist in the production of food, but inadvertently residues end up appearing in the food supply from the use of a processing aid, and therefore they're considered as food additives. Other nationalities or other countries typically, because there is no deliberate addition of processing aids supposedly to the finished food, would categorize them as a different category other than food additives. So there's GFoRSS also deals with flavoring agents, and these would also be considered as food additives, but also it deals with contaminants and natural toxins. The other main area of work for GFoRSS, specifically as it relates to food additives, it provides specifications and analytical methodologies. And so primarily, prior to a food additive being approved, you have to have a defined analytical methodology, which is readily available for most countries to use, which is able to detect the food additive. And then also, GFoRSS, through the Codex work, will also participate in the development of general principles related to food safety. So of interest, GFoRSS has produced a very large document which details the principles and methods for chemical risk assessment in food, and this is known as EHC, or Environmental Health Criteria number 240. And this publication is comprised of a number of chapters that are dealt with during food safety assessments, and these chapters are continually being updated by the GFoRSS committees. How is an expert meeting conducted by GFoRSS developed? Well, first, primarily we should mention that there is something known as a Codex Trust Fund, and what this allows is that it develops capacity for member states of Codex, and as I mentioned, approximately 96% of the world is a Codex member. So this Codex Trust Fund allows for these member states to engage on Codex activities. So essentially, what happens is that the main committees that are associated with the intentionally added substances appearing in the food supply, including food additives, a request to review a food additive or a GFoRSS assessment of a food additive is developed at Codex, the particular committee. In this case, it would be the Codex Committee on Food Additives. This request then is supported by the availability of documentation, and it makes it onto a Codex priority list. Subsequent to that, that request is then transferred to the appropriate GFoRSS committee, in this case, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, for an evaluation. There's a process that occurs behind the scene where a number of international experts who are assessed and simply they are vetted through a standardized process to ensure there is no conflict of interest prior to their participation as an independent expert in these meetings. Subsequent to the meeting being held and the food additive in question being reviewed by the expert committee, there's a report that's prepared following the outcome, and this report is then presented back to the appropriate Codex committee, but also all the member states of Codex. So essentially, this is just illustrating how Codex and GFoRSS are able to establish national dietary exposure for around the world. So essentially, the GEMS, the Global Environmental Monitoring System, has created a food consumption cluster diets, and these are based on per capita food intake throughout the world. So similarities in various countries are denoted by similarities in color, and these are based on per capita estimates. Also, approximately 44% of Codex member states have submitted to GEMS individual food intake data based on their own dietary surveys. So that's the other tool that GFoRSS and Codex are able to use in order to ensure accurate dietary exposure assessments. So as I mentioned, there is a specific output from the GFoRSS committees, and the most important point is that all the GFoRSS reports and publications are freely available. So generally, approximately 1 to 2 weeks after a meeting takes place where a food additive is consulted, there is a summary of this document, or the meeting is presented and available for public dissemination and reading. Subsequent to the decision of the meeting, generally within the year, a WHO technical report series, a GFoRSS monograph, and a food additive series are a variety of publications that can be generated. In particular, the GFoRSS food additive series, which has the entire toxicological monograph. So it will detail all the information that was reviewed and the decisions by the GFoRSS committee. So this is basically just a summary of what we've discussed, that the Codex committees receive requests to do assessments. These assessment requests are considered and passed on to the appropriate GFoRSS committee for food additives. That would be the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. The output of this scientific review is then provided as advice back to the appropriate Codex committees, which is then referred to the Codex Alimentation Commission, which then would lead to international food safety standards. So the main focus of the Alimentation Commission is for consumer protection from safe food and for fair food trade practices. So essentially, this flow chart will provide you with the direction. Following a Codex committee request for a particular assessment, in this case, a food additive, GFoRSS considers all hazard characterization data that is requested. It conducts an exposure assessment detailed using the cluster diets and the individual food consumption data that's available through GEMS. And following the GFoRSS risk assessment, there's a recommendation provided back to Codex for any appropriate risk management, and this would be in the form of, what foods a food additive can be used at and in what levels, and in particular development of maximum levels. And simply then there goes to the development of a Codex standard. So these are just a couple of examples, and primarily we're going to be dealing with some artificial sweeteners or some sugar substitutions. So in this particular case, there has been some controversy around the use of aspartame. And aspartame, as you see, is basically just phenylalanine combined with aspartic acid. And it's been widely used in food since the mid-1980s, and generally occurs or is included on food labels as either Nutraceut Equal or Sugar Twin. So the main issue is that From a caloric perspective, you need so much lower amounts of aspartame as compared to standard sucrose, in the fact that aspartame is approximately 200 times sweeter. So it's deemed safe by a large number of regulatory agencies, and it's used in a lot of processed foods. So back in 2023, IARC, and this is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified aspartame as a possible human carcinogen. So this is provided a bit of a controversy, considering aspartame at the time was an approved food additive. So basically, in response to the IR classification as a possibly carcinogenic to humans, and that's the third lowest category of a possible human carcinogen classification. Um, it was generated response by a number of regulatory agencies worldwide, including GFoRSS, and universally the entire decision reached was that it was considered that aspartame is still safe to use within its limit, and this health-based guidance value or limit was set at 40 milligram per kilogram body weight per day. And essentially, most of the regulatory agencies found there was no convincing evidence that associated aspartame consumption with a potential for developing cancer in humans. So essentially, what this classification resulted in was a call to the research community to better clarify and understand any prospective cancer risk associated with the use of aspartame. So, and this gets you into certain aspects where the International Agency for Research on Cancer has basically classified a number of food issues as human carcinogens or possible human carcinogens. So what IARC does is provide a cancer hazard identification. So it basically is can be defined as a hazard versus a risk determination. So in comparison, GFoRSS considers all toxicological effects, but only from oral or dietary exposure. They deal with a full hazard identification. They characterize this potential hazard through the development of a health-based guidance value, in this case, an acceptable daily intake. They do detailed exposure assessments from the diet, and then they define whether or not there is a potential risk associated with the exposure. So essentially, the main difference between IARC and GFoRSS is IR classifications are primarily reflecting on the strength of the scientific evidence, but they do not indicate the degree of risk of developing cancer. So essentially, the conclusion, what we've attempted to describe, is that GFoRSS, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, was established in the mid-1950s by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization, with a primary purpose to assess the safety of chemical additives. So these are chemicals that are being deliberately added to the food supply. And GFoRSS is able to provide an international basis because the experts that are invited to the meeting through a detailed selection process will provide an independent opinion. So the Codex Alimentation Commission, which was established in the early 1960s, its primary goal is to protect the health of consumers, but also to facilitate international trade, specifically in food. And as we previously mentioned, approximately 96% of the world belongs to Codex Alimentation Commission. So GFoRSS essentially, after receiving a request from Codex, the applicable committee, in this case the Codex Committee on Food Additives, will review a food additive and provide that opinion back to Codex. So in doing so, again, GFoRSS serves as an independent scientific committee. And this committee is producing outputs from the safety assessment of food additives, and that output is specifically available to both FAO, WHO, but all member countries of the Codex Alimentation Commission. So the main issue is that food additives, although they can be used for strictly organoleptic properties, also support food safety. And so the production and use of food additives in foods is one of the main goals is to produce a safe food supply. And the more important issue is that anything, including food additives that are being deliberately added to food, have very stringent safety requirements prior to their approval. So generally, what we would like to also introduce, if people aren't aware, is the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, or GFoRSS, and specific details of all the activities of GFoRSS can be found at www.gforss.org, and essentially looks to strengthen overall global food science and technology. And it does so through a number of activities related to participation in codex, but also supporting very strong food analytical methodologies and procedures related to exposure to foodborne chemicals. Thank you, and that concludes the presentation.